Giana sat alone at her small kitchen table, her hands trembling as she leafed through a stack of unpaid bills and crumpled job advertisements. The once bright room felt suffocating, the weight of her struggles pressing down on her. At 28, she had faced more hardships than most people endured in a lifetime. Raised in an orphanage with no family, she had built her life on sheer determination. Her soft green eyes and light brown hair belied the steely will beneath. But now, even her indomitable spirit was faltering. Her health was deteriorating, a dizzying weakness consuming her body daily. "I can't give up," she whispered to herself, gripping the edge of the table. The sharp sound of her phone ringing cut through the silence. Hope flickered in her chest as she saw an unknown number flash across the screen. Maybe, just maybe, this was the answer she needed. "Hello?" she answered, her voice a mix of anxiety and desperation. "Good afternoon. My name is Carly," came a sharp, authoritative voice. "We need a nurse to care for my husband. Your name was recommended to us." Giana's heart leaped. "I don't recall applying for this position," she said, trying to mask her eagerness. "My husband, Mr. Gregg, heard of your work. We need someone urgently," Carly continued curtly. "Can you come to the mansion today for an interview?" The words mansion and urgent swirled in Giana's mind. It seemed too good to be true, but she had no choice. "Yes, of course," she replied quickly. As she hung up, a pang of unease joined her fragile hope. Who was this family? Why her? But there was no time for questions. She had a chance, a lifeline, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. The Gregg mansion loomed before her, its grand facade both majestic and intimidating. Giana stood at the iron gates, her small frame dwarfed by the towering structure. Taking a deep breath, she rang the bell. The door swung open, revealing Carly, a tall woman with icy eyes and a rigid posture. Her tailored suit and sharp demeanor spoke of control. "Follow me," Carly said briskly, her tone devoid of warmth. Inside, opulence surrounded Giana. Yet something felt wrong. The cold silence, the meticulous order, and Carly's detached attitude created an unsettling atmosphere. During the interview, Carly spoke about her husband's illness with unnerving indifference. "Mr. Gregg has a rare disease. The doctors claim he has months to live, but I think they're exaggerating," she said, brushing the matter aside. Giana frowned. "I'm sorry to hear that. May I meet him?" Carly's lips thinned. "He's in his room. But let me be clear. I'm perfectly capable of handling things myself. You're here because he insists." Before Giana could respond, a man in gardening clothes accidentally entered the room. Carly's eyes burned with disdain. "Do you have no eyes? Get out!" she snapped. The gardener muttered an apology, shoulders slumped as he exited. Giana couldn't ignore the pang of sympathy she felt for him. Does she treat everyone like this? She wondered, her unease growing. Soon, Carly led her to Mr. Gregg's room. The sight that greeted Giana was horrifying. The man, pale and frail, lay gasping for breath. His chest heaved with effort, and his green eyes were sunken but alert. "He's not breathing!" Giana exclaimed, rushing to his side. She adjusted his position and began chest compressions, her training taking over. After a tense moment, Gregg's breath returned in a weak gasp. "You have angel hands," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Relief washed over Giana, but the sight of his thin, neglected form filled her with anger. Has he been cared for at all? She thought bitterly. "You did something good," Carly said, her tone devoid of genuine praise. "But I don't think we need you. He's improving." Gregg's weak voice cut through the tension. "Number, I want her to stay." His words were firm, despite his frailty. Giana glanced at Carly, whose face darkened with resentment. "If you agree, I'd like a full-time position," Giana said cautiously. "I can stay in a small room, even an armchair, so I'm close if he needs help." Gregg nodded. "Give her the best guest room. It's the least we can do." Carly's lips pursed, but she didn't argue. Giana couldn't shake the feeling that Carly's disapproval wasn't just about her presence. It was something deeper, something darker. Weeks later, as Giana settled into her role, her health continued to worsen. But every time she thought of leaving, she remembered Greg's gratitude and frailty. "He needs me," she told herself. Yet, beneath the surface, shadows stirred in the mansion, secrets that would soon erupt into chaos. Days turned into weeks, and Giana quickly adapted to her life at the mansion. Her days revolved around Mr. Greg's care, administering medication, preparing meals that he could stomach, and keeping his spirits up. But something about the mansion always felt off. Carly's presence was like a shadow, cold, calculating, and overbearing. She would appear unexpectedly, her sharp eyes scrutinizing every move Giana made. "Don't get too comfortable," Carly once said, her tone laced with thinly veiled hostility. Despite the tension, Giana found solace in Mr. Greg. Though frail, he had a kind heart and a quiet wisdom that made her feel valued. "You remind me of someone," he said one evening as she adjusted his pillows. "I can't quite place it, but there's something familiar about you." Giana smiled softly, brushing off the comment. Yet, she couldn't deny the strange bond she felt with him. One night, while organizing Mr. Greg's medication, Giana noticed a small, unlabeled bottle among the usual prescriptions. "What's this?" she asked aloud. Mr. Greg's green eyes flickered with a hint of urgency. "I asked a friend to leave it here," he said, his voice strained. "It's important, but I'll explain later. For now, just keep it safe." Before Giana could press further, Carly barged in, her voice slicing through the moment. "What are you two whispering about?" she demanded, her gaze darting between them. "Nothing," Giana replied calmly, though her heart raced. Carly's eyes lingered on the bottle for a moment before she turned and left, but Giana knew she had noticed it. That night, as Giana prepared to sleep, she couldn't shake the unease gnawing at her. Why was Carly so hostile? And what was the significance of the mysterious medication? It was early morning when Giana found Mr. Greg sitting upright, a rare occurrence. His breathing was labored, but his eyes burned with a determination she hadn't seen before. "Giana," he began, his voice trembling, "there's something I need you to do for me." "Of course, Mr. Greg," she said, moving closer. "What do you need?" He took a shallow breath, each word a struggle. I want you to pretend to be my daughter, just for a day." The request caught her off guard. "Your daughter? But why?" He hesitated, his eyes searching hers for understanding. "I don't have much time left. There's something I need to resolve before it's too late." Giana's chest tightened. She wanted to argue, to reassure him that he would recover, but the frailty in his voice silenced her. "Okay," she whispered, her voice heavy with emotion. "If it's that important to you, I'll do it." "Thank you," he said, his voice cracking. "You don't know how much this means to me." Before she could ask more, the door burst open. Carly stormed in, accompanied by a sharply dressed man carrying a briefcase. "Greg, it's time," she announced, her tone brisk. "What's going on?" Giana asked, stepping between Carly and the bed. Carly sneered. "It's none of your business, nurse. My husband needs to sign his will." "No," Mr. Gregg said, his voice weak but firm. "Not now." Carly's patience snapped. "This is for your own good, Greg. We need to finalize this today." Giana's stomach churned. She glanced at Mr. Gregg, who looked pale and exhausted, and then back at Carly. The pieces began to click into place. "She's forcing him," Giana thought. "Leave us!" Carly barked at Giana. "No," Giana said firmly, her heart pounding. "I'm staying." Carly's face darkened, but before she could retaliate, Mr. Gregg spoke. "Giana stays. That's final." The tension in the room was suffocating. The lawyer hesitated, sensing the hostility. "Perhaps we should give Mr. Gregg some time to rest," he suggested, but Carly shot him a glare that silenced him. Suddenly, Mr. Gregg's body convulsed as a violent cough racked through him. Giana rushed to his side, instinctively grabbing the emergency oxygen mask. "He's struggling to breathe," she cried, her voice thick with panic. "This is your fault," Carly accused, pointing an accusatory finger at Giana. Ignoring her, Giana focused on stabilizing Mr. Gregg. "Stay with me," she whispered, her hands trembling as she worked. The machines monitoring his vitals beeped erratically, each sound a reminder of how fragile his life had become. Carly, seemingly indifferent to his suffering, turned to the lawyer. "We need his signature before it's too late." Giana snapped her head up. "Are you insane? He's dying and all you care about is a piece of paper?" Carly's eyes narrowed. "Stay out of this, nurse." "No," Giana said, her voice rising. "I won't let you do this." In the chaos, Mr. Gregg's hand weakly gestured toward the tray with the mysterious bottle. Giana hesitated for a moment, then grabbed it. Her heart raced as she prepared to administer the unknown medication. "What are you doing?" Carly shrieked, lunging toward her. "Saving his life," Giana shot back, injecting the medication into his IV. Time seemed to freeze as everyone watched. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Mr. Gregg's breathing stabilized, and the erratic beeping of the machines began to slow. "You're insane," Carly hissed, her face red with fury. "If he dies, it's on you." But Giana ignored her, focusing entirely on Mr. Gregg. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect you," she whispered. As the tension eased, Carly's rage boiled over. "You're fired," she spat. "You can't fire me," Giana said, meeting Carly's glare. "He needs me." The room fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by Mr. Gregg's raspy breathing. Giana knew this was far from over. Carly wouldn't give up so easily, and the mansion held secrets that could destroy them all. The following days were a blur of tension. Carly's hostility grew sharper, and her presence became increasingly suffocating. Every time Giana entered Mr. Gregg's room, she felt Carly's icy gaze tracking her movements. The air in the mansion seemed heavy with secrets, and Giana knew she was walking a dangerous line. One evening, as she checked Mr. Gregg's vitals, he reached for her hand. His voice was barely a whisper. "Giana, I need you to promise me something." "Anything," she said softly, leaning closer. "You have to be strong. Carly." He paused, his breathing labored. "She's hiding something. I've been too weak to fight her, but I need you to protect yourself." Giana's heart pounded. "What is she hiding? Does it have to do with the will?" Mr. Gregg nodded weakly. "And more. There are documents in the study. They prove everything." Before he could continue, the door burst open. Carly stormed in, her face a mask of fury. "What are you doing?" she snapped, glaring at Giana. "Just taking care of my patient," Giana replied, her voice steady despite the tension. Carly's eyes narrowed. "Well, you won't be doing that for much longer. I've had enough of your meddling." "Mrs. Carly," Giana said, her frustration boiling over. "I'm only here because Mr. Gregg needs proper care. If you don't trust me, why keep me here?" Carly's lips curled into a cold smile. "Because it's not up to me. He insists on keeping you. But don't think for a second that you're safe." Giana clenched her fists as Carly swept out of the room, her threat lingering in the air. Later that night, Giana couldn't sleep. Mr. Gregg's words about the documents haunted her. She knew she was taking a risk, but she couldn't ignore his warning. Quietly, she slipped out of her room and made her way to the study. The mansion was eerily silent, the only sound the soft creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. When she reached the study, she hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. Inside, the room was dark, the faint moonlight casting shadows over the shelves and desk. Giana began searching, her hands trembling as she rifled through papers and drawers. Finally, she found a locked compartment. Her pulse quickened. This must be it, she thought. Just as she began searching for a way to open it, a voice behind her made her freeze. "What do you think you're doing?" She turned to see Carly standing in the doorway, her expression a mix of rage and suspicion. I was looking for the patient's medical records," Giana stammered, trying to steady her voice. Carly stepped closer, her heels clicking ominously against the floor. "You're lying," she said coldly. "Get out of this room, now." Knowing she had no choice, Giana left, but not without stealing one last glance at the locked compartment. Whatever Carly was hiding, it was clear she would go to any lengths to keep it secret. The next morning, Mr. Gregg's condition took a sudden turn for the worse. His breathing was shallow, and his skin had turned an alarming shade of pale. Giana worked frantically to stabilize him, her mind racing with everything she had learned. As she adjusted his IV, he opened his eyes and whispered, "Giana, the documents. Find them." Tears pricked her eyes. "I will. But right now, I need to focus on you." Before she could say more, the lawyer arrived, accompanied by Carly. "Gregg," Carly said, her voice sickly sweet, "it's time to finalize the will. You don't have much longer." Giana stepped between them, her voice firm. "He's in no condition to make decisions right now." Carly's mask of sweetness slipped. "Stay out of this," she snapped. "No," Giana shot back. "I won't let you exploit him." Before Carly could respond, Mr. Gregg struggled to speak. "Giana, the drawer in the study. You need to—" "Stop!" Carly interrupted, her face twisting with anger. "He's delirious. Don't listen to him." But Giana's mind was already racing. The locked compartment. Those were the documents he wanted her to find. That night, she made her move. Armed with a makeshift lockpick, she crept back to the study. Her heart pounded as she worked to open the compartment, each click of the lock echoing in the silence. Finally, it gave way. Inside, she found a stack of papers and an envelope. Her hands shook as she read the contents, a detailed report of financial transactions, evidence of Carly siphoning money from Gregg's accounts, and a paternity test. The test confirmed what Giana had never dared to hope. She was Mr. Gregg's biological daughter. Tears blurred her vision. "It can't be," she whispered, her voice breaking. Suddenly, she heard footsteps approaching. Stuffing the papers into her uniform pocket, she closed the compartment and hurried back to her room, her mind spinning. The next morning, Carly confronted her in the hallway. "You've been snooping," she said, her voice low and venomous. "I don't know what you're talking about," Giana replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. Carly stepped closer, her eyes blazing. "You think you're smart, don't you? But you have no idea who you're dealing with." Giana held her ground. "Neither do you," she said quietly, her hand brushing against the hidden papers in her pocket. As Carly stormed away, Giana knew the battle was far from over. But now she had the truth, and she wouldn't stop until Mr. Gregg was safe. The morning after her discovery, Giana was summoned to Mr. Gregg's room. His condition had worsened dramatically overnight, and the sight of him, pale and struggling to breathe, sent a pang of anguish through her. She approached his bedside, clutching the papers she had found. "Mr. Gregg," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "There's something I need to tell you." His green eyes fluttered open, faint but focused on her. "What is it, Giana?" he rasped. She hesitated, the weight of her discovery almost too much to bear. I found the documents, the ones in the study." His expression softened, as if he had been expecting this moment. "Then you know," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Tears welled in her eyes. "You're my father," she choked out. Gregg's hand trembled as he reached for hers. "I hoped you'd find out before it was too late," he said. "I've known for some time, but I didn't want to burden you." "Burden me?" Giana's voice rose, a mix of anger and grief. "I spent my whole life alone, wondering if I'd ever have a family. And you were here all along." Gregg's eyes glistened with tears. "I didn't know about you until recently. Your mother, she left without telling me. If I had known, I would have moved heaven and earth to find you." Giana's tears fell freely now, a lifetime of longing and pain pouring out. "All this time I thought I was nobody, and now you're telling me I had a father who cared?" Gregg squeezed her hand weakly. "You are not nobody, Giana. You are my daughter, and I am so proud of you." Their moment was interrupted by the sudden arrival of Carly, her expression twisted with fury. "What's going on here?" she demanded. Giana stood, her grief hardening into resolve. "He's my father," she said firmly, holding up the paternity test. Carly's face blanched, but she quickly recovered, her lips curling into a sneer. "That changes nothing. You think you'll inherit anything? Think again." Giana's heart pounded as she stepped closer to Carly. "I'm not after his fortune, but I won't let you hurt him anymore." Carly's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Hurt him? You've been a thorn in this family's side since the day you arrived. You have no idea what you're up against." Before Giana could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps filled the hallway. The door swung open to reveal Dr. Patrick, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. "Carly Gregg," Dr. Patrick said, his voice calm but commanding, "we have evidence of your crimes. You're under arrest for fraud and attempted murder." Carly's bravado crumbled in an instant. "This is ridiculous," she shrieked, backing away as the officers approached. "You have no proof." Dr. Patrick held up a folder. "We have everything we need: bank records, medical reports, and testimony from your accomplices. It's over." Carly's gaze darted around the room, desperate for an escape, but there was none. As the officers led her away, she turned to Giana, her eyes blazing with hatred. "You'll regret this," she spat. But Giana stood her ground, her heart steady for the first time in years. "No, Carly, you're the one who will." With Carly gone, the mansion felt lighter, as if a dark cloud had been lifted. Greg's recovery was slow but steady, thanks to the care of Dr. Patrick and the experimental treatment that Giana had unknowingly administered. One afternoon, Giana found Greg sitting by the window, sunlight streaming over his face. He looked stronger, a faint color returning to his cheeks. "You're looking better," she said, smiling as she sat beside him. "I have you to thank for that," he replied, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "You saved me, Giana, in more ways than one." She shook her head. "You gave me something I never thought I'd have. A family. That means more than anything." Greg reached for her hand, his grip firm. "We have a lot of time to make up for. But first, there's something I want to do." "What's that?" His eyes twinkled with a hint of mischief. "Remember the day I asked you to pretend to be my daughter? I promised you a day at the beach. It's time I made good on that promise." Giana laughed, the sound light and joyful. "I'd like that, Dad." The word felt foreign on her tongue, but it also felt right. So, a week later, Giana and Greg stood on the shore, the ocean stretching endlessly before them. The salty breeze carried the sound of waves crashing against the sand, and for the first time in years, Giana felt truly at peace. "This is perfect," she said, watching the sunlight dance on the water. Greg nodded. "It's just the beginning. We have a lifetime of memories to create." They spent the day laughing, sharing stories, and dreaming about the future. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Giana felt a deep sense of gratitude. For the first time, she wasn't alone. She had a father, a family, and a purpose. Back at the mansion, Giana took on a new role at Greg's Pharmaceutical Institute, using her experiences to advocate for patients and train caregivers. Together, she and Greg dedicated themselves to making a difference, ensuring that no one else would endure the pain and neglect they had faced. Their journey had been fraught with challenges, but it had led them to something beautiful, a bond forged in resilience, love, and hope. And as they stood together, watching the waves roll in, they knew that the best chapters of their story were yet to come. Giana and Greg stood together in his office, the sunlight streaming through the windows, illuminating the room that once held so many secrets. Now, it symbolized new beginnings. "I never thought life could change so much," Giana said, a soft smile on her face. "From being alone to having a family and a purpose, it still feels like a dream." Greg placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze warm and steady. You've taught me the importance of fighting for what matters. Together we'll build something greater, a legacy of love and compassion. Their journey had been anything but easy, but the trials had strengthened their bond. Greg was healthier than ever, his pharmaceutical institute thriving under their shared leadership. Giana, once a struggling nurse, had become a voice for the voiceless, advocating for patients and caregivers alike. As they prepared to leave for another day of making a difference, Greg turned to Giana. "I hope you're ready for tomorrow. We have an interview about our new initiative. The world needs to hear our story." She nodded, determination in her eyes. "If it inspires even one person to fight for justice and hope, it'll all be worth it. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If Giana and Greg's story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to life. Wishing you all an incredible day filled with hope, love, and happiness. Stay tuned for more heartfelt tales, and may your life be as extraordinary as the stories we share.